She set the rejection letter on fire, right there on the boardwalk in front of the Silver Creek post office. Rosemary Bennett struck a match, held the folded paper over the flame, and watched 6 years of waiting curl into ash. Her fingers didn't shake. Her jaw didn't tremble. She had promised herself she would not cry in public ever again, not after what Daniel Holt had done to her in front of half of Chicago, and she had kept that promise for 11 months and 14 days. She dropped the burning paper into the snow and walked away from it without looking back. She had one name left on a list that had once held 43. One advertisement cut from the back of a newspaper. One chance she hadn't taken yet because she already knew how it would end. She pulled her coat tighter, tucked the clipping into her sleeve, and started walking toward the stagecoach office. She had nothing left to lose. That was almost the same as being free. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Walker Ranch advertisement had been printed in small type at the bottom of a page no one bothered to read all the way through. Widowed rancher, 3 children, Montana Territory, seeking capable woman for domestic position. Room and board provided, references not required, genuine character preferred. Rosemary had nearly thrown it away. She'd read those kinds of advertisements before. Genuine character preferred usually meant the man had given up on finding someone pretty and was settling for someone useful. She understood that language. She had been living inside it her entire adult life. But the word that stopped her was children. Not housekeeper wanted. Not cook needed. He had written children first before anything else, like they were the point. Like whoever answered that advertisement ought to understand from the very first line that the children came before everything. She folded the clipping and put it in her coat pocket and didn't look at it again for 3 days. Then she wrote the letter. She had not expected a reply. When the reply came, it was 4 sentences long and signed C. Walker. It said he had received 12 letters. It said he had read hers twice. It said the position was still available. It said the stagecoach from Billings arrived on Tuesdays. She packed her suitcase that same night. The stagecoach into Silver Creek was crowded and cold and smelled of wet wool and boot leather. Rosemary sat in the rear corner with her bag between her feet and watched Montana pass by the window in frozen silence. The woman across from her had been talking steadily for 2 hours about her daughter's wedding and her son-in-law's cattle operation, and the particular way Silver Creek people treated newcomers like family. She had not once looked directly at Rosemary while she spoke. Most people didn't. Rosemary had learned not to expect it. The stage rolled to a stop in front of a narrow clapboard building with a painted sign that read, Silver Creek established 1871. 3 men were waiting near the horses. 2 women stood under the awning with their arms crossed. And standing back from all of them, slightly apart, the way a man stands when he isn't sure he belongs in the middle of things, was someone who could only have been Cole Walker. She knew him because of the children. There were 3 of them behind him, lined up the way children line up when they've been told very specifically to stand still and not cause trouble. The oldest was a girl, maybe 11, with dark hair pulled back, and an expression that had no business being on a child's face. It was the expression of someone who had already learned to expect disappointment and had stopped bothering to feel surprised by it. The middle one was small and fair, and stood with both her hands twisted together in front of her, watching the stage door, like she was afraid of what might come out. And the youngest, a boy maybe 5, stood so close to his father's leg that his shoulder pressed against Cole Walker's knee, and he didn't look at the stage door at all. He looked at the snow. Rosemary stepped down from the stagecoach. She heard it immediately. She always did. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just the quality of silence that changed the way a group of people who were talking suddenly weren't anymore, and the way that stillness had a specific weight to it. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level and walked toward the man with the tired eyes and the 3 children at his back. "Mr. Walker," she said. He looked at her. Not past her, not through her. He just looked at her the way a man looks when he's taking account of something he hasn't decided what to do with yet. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Quieter, like a man who had gotten out of the habit of talking loudly because nobody was listening anyway. "That's me," she said. One of the women under the awning said something to the other in a low voice. Rosemary didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, and she had long since learned that the tone was the only part that mattered. She kept her attention on Cole Walker. "You came a long way," he said. "I did. You eat before you left Billings." She blinked. It was not the question she'd expected. "I had something at the station." He nodded once. "Then we'll get you settled before supper." He reached for her suitcase without asking permission, the way a man reaches for something heavy, because it's simply the thing to do, and Rosemary felt the handle leave her grip before she'd thought to hold on tighter. He turned toward the wagon. "Emma," he said, "say hello to Miss Bennet." The eldest girl looked at Rosemary with those eyes that had seen too much already. "Hello, Miss Bennet," she said. Her voice was perfectly polite. Her face gave nothing away. "Hello, Emma," Rosemary said. "Lucy," Cole said. The middle girl, fair, small, anxious, stepped forward half a step. "Hi," she said very quietly, and then stepped back. "Hi, Lucy," Rosemary said. Cole Walker looked down at his youngest. "Ben." The boy did not look up from the snow. Cole didn't push. He just put his hand on the boy's shoulder and steered him gently toward the wagon. Rosemary followed. She could still feel the eyes on her back from the boardwalk. She was practiced enough not to flinch. She was almost at the wagon when she felt something brush her hand. She looked down. Ben Walker had reached up without being told, without being asked, without looking at her face first, and wrapped 3 small fingers around 2 of hers. His hand was cold from the winter air. He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ground, and his jaw was set the way small children set their jaws when they are trying very hard not to need something they already need. Rosemary stood completely still for one breath. Then she closed her fingers around his. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. They walked to the wagon that way, and she stepped up onto the bench, and he climbed up beside her, and she did not make a thing of it because she understood instinctively that making a thing of it would have ended it. Some kindnesses only survive if you let them be ordinary. Cole Walker glanced at his son. Then he glanced at Rosemary. He picked up the reins and said nothing, and the wagon rolled forward through the Silver Creek snow. From behind them on the boardwalk, a woman's voice carried clearly through the cold air. "Well, I suppose when you've got no other options?" Emma, seated in the wagon bed, went very still. Cole Walker's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. Rosemary looked straight ahead at the road, and Ben tightened his 3 fingers against hers, still without looking up. The Walker Ranch sat 2 miles east of town, up a long grade that the horses took slowly in the slicked snow. The house itself was not what Rosemary had imagined when she read the word ranch. She had imagined something larger. What she saw instead was a house that had been built by someone who believed in solid work and had run short of time somewhere around the back addition. It was the kind of house where you could see exactly what had happened to the person who built it. The front porch was neat and deliberate, and the kitchen extension was crooked and rushed, and there was a window on the second floor with no curtain in it. And that missing curtain said more about the last 2 years of Cole Walker's life than anything he might have told her directly. She did not say any of this. She stepped down from the wagon, thanked Cole when he offered his hand for the step, and walked through the front door behind Emma, who had not spoken again since the boardwalk. The kitchen was cold. The breakfast dishes from that morning were still on the table. There was a coat on the floor near the door that nobody had picked up, and a boot sitting alone by the hearth with no partner, and a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold on the counter. It was not a dirty house exactly. It was a house where the person keeping it had too many things to hold at once, and had started setting some of them down and forgetting to pick them back up. Rosemary took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. Do you have an apron? She asked. Cole blinked. Somewhere. Margaret had... He stopped. I'll find one. No need to find it right now, she said. What do you have in the larder? He told her. She listened. She rolled up her sleeves and she started on supper, and she did not wait to be shown where things were. She opened cabinets until she found them, and she asked Emma when she couldn't, because she had already determined that Emma was the person in this house who knew where everything was, and resented that she did. Where does your father keep the salt? Rosemary asked. Second shelf, left side, Emma said from the doorway. Thank you. Rosemary found it, measured it into her palm, added it to the pot. Does your father take his coffee at supper or after? A pause. After, with 1 spoon of sugar. And Lucy? A longer pause. She doesn't like things too hot. She burns her tongue and then she cries. I'll keep that in mind, Rosemary said. She heard Emma take a single step into the kitchen. Most of the women who came for this position tried to tell me right away how much they loved children, Emma said. There was nothing sweet about the way she said it. It was a statement of fact delivered the way a person delivers facts when they are tired of being lied to. They always said it in the first 10 minutes, before they'd talk to us at all. Rosemary stirred the pot. I expect they thought it was what you wanted to hear. It wasn't. No, Rosemary agreed. I don't suppose it was. Another pause, shorter this time. What do you want to hear? Rosemary asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Nothing yet, she said. I'll decide what I want to hear once I know if you're going to stay. Rosemary looked over her shoulder. Emma was standing with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up and her eyes careful and watchful, and so much older than 11 had any right to be. Rosemary had seen that look before. She had worn it herself at different ages, in different kitchens, for different reasons. That's fair, Rosemary said. She turned back to the stove. Emma stayed in the doorway. Supper that night was the first warm meal the Walker household had eaten together, Cole admitted quietly after the children had left the table close to 3 weeks. Not because there was no food, because he couldn't manage the cooking and the chores and the grief all at once, and at some point he'd started making choices about which one to let go of, and supper was the easiest to let go of. You don't have to explain it to me, Rosemary said. She was clearing the plates. You've been managing a great deal alone. Margaret handled the house, Cole said. He was still at the table. He had his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, the way a man holds something warm when he doesn't know what else to do with himself. She made it look like nothing. I didn't understand until she was gone how much of everything she was doing. Most people don't, Rosemary said. Until after. You lost someone. His voice wasn't prying. It was the voice of a man who was asking because he recognized something in the way she said it. No, she said. She set the plates in the basin. But I've spent a long time being the person who holds things together while other people live their lives inside them. I understand the weight of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lonely way to live. She did not answer right away. She picked up the dishcloth and started working. It has its moments, she said finally. Cole Walker drank his coffee and didn't push, and she was grateful for that. Some people, when they sensed a wound, pressed their fingers into it to see how deep it went. Cole Walker was not one of those people. He sat with the silence like a man who had made peace with the fact that some things didn't need to be prodded. She respected that more than she would have been able to say. Later, when the house had gone quiet, and Cole had gone to the barn for the last check on the horses, Rosemary carried a lamp up the narrow stairs to the small room she'd been given. She set it on the windowsill and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in the lamplight. They were red from the dishwater. They were always red from something. She thought about the letter she had burned. She thought about the 11 months and 14 days since Chicago. She thought about Daniel Holt standing up in front of his friends at the Marquette Hotel and announcing loudly with that particular brand of cruelty that disguises itself as honesty that he had decided he could not in good conscience pursue a future with a woman who did not present herself in a manner befitting the life he intended to build. He had said present herself, not be herself, present herself, like she was a package that had arrived in the wrong shape. She had not cried at the Marquette Hotel. She had stood very still and looked at him for a count of 3. And then she had picked up her gloves from the table, and she had said in a voice that did not shake, "I hope your future is everything you've designed it to be, Daniel." And then she had walked out of the hotel dining room and down 2 flights of stairs and through the front door and 4.5 blocks to her rooming house. And she had sat on the floor of her room with her back against the bed, and she had cried until she had nothing left. That was the last time. She had promised herself. That was the last time anyone else's cruelty would be the thing that brought her to the floor. A sound from down the hall pulled her back. Soft, barely there. The kind of sound a person makes when they are trying hard not to make any sound at all. She picked up the lamp and went into the hallway. Ben's door was the second on the left. It was not fully closed. Through the gap, she could hear the sound more clearly now, not crying exactly, but breathing. That was too fast and too jagged to be sleeping. The kind of breathing that comes from a child who has been awake in the dark long enough for their own mind to become the enemy. She pushed the door open softly. Ben was sitting up in bed with his knees pulled to his chest and his face turned toward the wall. He did not look at her when the lamplight came in. He had the posture of a child who had decided to manage things alone and was not managing. Rosemary crossed the room without a word and sat down on the edge of his bed. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She set the lamp on the small table by his bed, and she simply sat there the way you sit beside someone who is in the middle of something and doesn't need to be interrupted by it, just accompanied through it. Ben's breathing gradually slowed. After a while, she could not have said how long he unfolded slightly. Just one shoulder dropping, one knee releasing its grip on itself. He still didn't look at her. He lay back down on his side and pulled the quilt up, and Rosemary reached out and straightened the edge of it where it had bunched, and she left her hand there on the quilt for a moment. He put his hand on top of hers. Same 3 fingers. Same grip. She sat there until his breathing evened out into sleep. Then she picked up the lamp and walked quietly back to her room and sat again on the edge of her bed and looked at the calluses on her palm where 3 small fingers had pressed. She had come to Silver Creek expecting to be turned away. She had expected the look she'd gotten from the women on the boardwalk and the silence on the wagon ride and the careful evaluating coldness of an 11-year-old who had learned to protect herself by never letting anyone close enough to leave a mark when they walked away. She had expected all of it. She had not expected this. She had not expected to feel in the dark of a stranger's house in the middle of a Montana winter with the wind pressing at the window and the lamp burning low on the sill that she was somewhere she was supposed to be. She did not trust that feeling. She had been burned by that feeling before. It was the most dangerous kind of feeling, the kind that arrived quietly and made itself at home before you'd thought to ask its intentions. But she was here, and the boy was asleep down the hall, and the kitchen smelled like the supper she'd made, and that was enough for tonight. She blew out the lamp. Downstairs she heard Cole Walker come in from the barn stamp. The snow from his boots hang his coat on the peg. She heard him pause at the bottom of the stairs. A long pause, the kind that meant he had noticed the lamp was out and was deciding whether the quiet meant something good or something bad. Then she heard his boots cross the front room and his bedroom door close and silence settle over the house. Rosemary lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Most women leave after a week, Emma had told her. She had not asked Emma how she knew that. She hadn't needed to. Emma knew because she had counted, because she had watched and waited, and every time she had let herself believe slightly less, because believing the same amount each time cost too much. Most women leave after a week. Rosemary pressed her palm flat against the quilt. Not this one, she thought. Not this time. She closed her eyes, and outside the window, the Montana snow came down in silence over the Walker Ranch, and for the first time in 11 months and 15 days, Rosemary Bennett slept without dreaming of running away from anything. Emma Walker was already awake when Rosemary came downstairs the next morning. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a schoolbook open in front of her and a cup of something cold that had clearly been poured a long time ago and forgotten, and she looked up when Rosemary's foot hit the bottom stair with the particular expression of a person who has been waiting and is not going to admit it. "You're still here," Emma said. "I am," Rosemary said. She went to the stove without ceremony, checked the firebox added wood, and put the kettle on. She could feel Emma watching her the whole time. She did not perform for the attention. She simply moved through the kitchen the way she moved through any kitchen efficiently, without apology, without the particular self-consciousness that came from believing you were being evaluated. She had been evaluated her entire life. She had learned to let it happen around her instead of to her. "Most women made a big fuss in the mornings," Emma said, "trying to show Papa how useful they were." "I'm not trying to show anyone anything," Rosemary said. "I'm making breakfast." Emma turned a page in her book that she clearly hadn't read. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" "I do. Mama's biscuits had honey in them." Rosemary paused with her hand on the flour tin. She set it down and turned to look at Emma directly. "I'm not going to make your mother's biscuits," she said, not unkindly. "I don't know her recipe. What I can make are my grandmother's biscuits, which have a little rosemary in them because she was contrary enough to name her granddaughter after an herb, and then put that herb in everything she cooked. They are not your mother's biscuits. If you want to try them, I'll make them. If you don't, I'll make something else." Emma stared at her. Then she looked back at her book. "Fine," she said. "Make your biscuits." Rosemary made her biscuits. Lucy came down 20 minutes later with her hair, a disaster, half of it pulled loose from the braid she'd clearly attempted herself, the other half still matted from sleep. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Rosemary at the stove and did the thing small children do when they aren't sure whether a new person is safe yet, which is stand perfectly still and try to become less visible by making themselves smaller. "Good morning, Lucy," Rosemary said without turning around. "Your hair looks like it had its own adventure last night." Lucy made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately suppressed it. "I can't braid it myself," she said. "Emma won't do it right." "I do it perfectly fine," Emma said flatly from the table. "You pull too hard." "Because you squirm." "Because you pull too hard." Rosemary set down her spoon. "Come here, Lucy." Lucy crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and Rosemary turned her gently by the shoulders and began to work through the tangles with her fingers, starting at the ends, and working up the way her grandmother had taught her, slow and careful, so it didn't catch and hurt. Lucy went very still, the kind of still that meant she was paying attention to how it felt. "That doesn't hurt," Lucy said with some surprise. "It shouldn't hurt," Rosemary said. "You've got good hair, it just needs to be listened to." "Hair doesn't have ears," Lucy said. "No. But it knows when someone's in a hurry and not paying attention, and it fights back." Lucy considered this with great seriousness. "Emma's always in a hurry." "I am standing right here," Emma said. "I know," Lucy said. Rosemary braided Lucy's hair in two plaits, neat and even, and tied them off with the bits of ribbon Lucy produced from her apron pocket, like she'd been carrying them hopefully for some time. When she was done, Lucy reached up and felt both braids carefully checking their symmetry with the focused concentration of a child conducting a quality inspection. "They match," Lucy announced. "They do," Rosemary agreed. Lucy turned around and looked up at her with those fair wide eyes, and for a moment she looked like she was going to say something significant. Instead, she just nodded once, like a decision had been made, and went to the table and sat down next to Emma and opened her own book. Rosemary turned back to the stove. Cole came in from the barn a few minutes later, stamping cold from his boots, and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the table, both girls, seated, books open, hair neat, and then at the stove where the biscuits were out of the pan, and the eggs were nearly done, and the kitchen smelled like something warm and real for the first time in longer than he wanted to calculate. "Ben's still asleep," he said more to himself than anyone. "Let him sleep," Rosemary said. "He was up late." Cole looked at her. "You heard him. I sat with him for a while." She said it simply, without making it a demonstration of anything. "He settled. Cole stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. Then he hung his coat on the peg and came to the table and sat down, and Rosemary set a plate in front of him without asking whether he was hungry, because she already knew he wouldn't say he was, even if he hadn't eaten since noon the day before, which she suspected was exactly the case. He took one bite of the biscuit and stopped. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with the biscuit in his hand, and something moved through his expression that he shut down immediately, the way a man shuts down anything that might open into something larger than he's prepared to manage before breakfast. "Rosemary and them," Emma said from behind her book. "She named after an herb." "Rosemary in them," Rosemary confirmed. Cole took another bite. "They're good," he said. That was all. But he ate 2 of them, and Rosemary counted that as its own kind of conversation. Ben came downstairs 20 minutes into breakfast, dragging his blanket behind him, his hair standing at an angle that suggested he had slept hard and well. He stopped when he reached the bottom of the stairs and saw the kitchen. The full table, the warm plates, the girls arguing quietly over something in Lucy's reader. And he stood there with his blanket in his fist, and his eyes moving slowly around the room, like he was checking whether it was real. Then his eyes found Rosemary. She was at the stove with her back to him. She said without turning, "Your plate's keeping warm on the back burner, Ben. Can you reach it, or do you want me to get it?" Ben crossed the kitchen, stood on his toes, and pulled the plate forward himself. He carried it to the table and sat down in his chair and ate. And he didn't hold her hand this time, but twice during the meal she caught him watching her from under his lashes, and both times he looked away quickly, like he'd been caught doing something private. That was its own kind of trust, and she recognized it. The first real fracture came at the end of the first week. It came from Emma, as Rosemary had known it would, because Emma was the one paying the closest attention, and therefore the one most likely to notice when something shifted. And something had shifted by the end of that first week, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small daily things. The way the kitchen was warm every morning. The way Lucy's hair was always neat. The way Ben had started appearing in whatever room Rosemary was in, without any apparent reason for being there, simply occupying the same space, like a cat who has decided you are acceptable without intending to make a whole thing of it. Emma noticed all of it. And on the 7th day, she came to Rosemary while Rosemary was mending one of Ben's shirts and said with that precise, deliberate calm of hers, "You're going to leave." Rosemary kept her eyes on the needle. "What makes you think that?" "They all leave," Emma said. "Even the ones who say they won't. They say they love us, and then something happens and they go." She paused. "Mrs. Aldrich from town lasted 9 days. She said she loved children. She left because Ben wouldn't talk to her and Lucy cried too much and Papa was too quiet." "Ben doesn't talk to anyone," Rosemary said. "He held your hand on the first day." Rosemary looked up. Emma's face hadn't changed, but something behind it had some small, careful thing that she was guarding very closely but couldn't quite keep from showing entirely. "I know," Rosemary said. "He never did that. Not with anyone. Not even—" Emma stopped. "Not with anyone," she said again, in a slightly different voice. Rosemary set down the shirt. "Emma, look at me." Emma looked at her. "I am not going to promise you I'll never leave," Rosemary said. "You're too smart for promises, and I respect you too much to make one I can't fully guarantee. What I will tell you is that right now today, I am not going anywhere. And tomorrow, I will tell you the same thing. And that is the only honest way I know how to do this." Emma was quiet for so long that Rosemary thought she'd said the wrong thing entirely. Then Emma said, "That's more honest than anyone else has been." "I figured you deserved honesty," Rosemary said. "More than most." Emma picked up the shirt Rosemary had set down and looked at the mend with a critical eye. "You're pulling the thread too tight on the left side," she said. "It'll pucker when he wears it." Rosemary looked at the stitch. Emma was right. "Show me," she said. Emma sat down, and for the next half hour, they mended Ben's shirt together in near silence, and Emma showed her how the stitching ought to lay, and Rosemary let herself be corrected without flinching. And that exchange, that ordinary, unremarkable exchange, mattered more than either of them said out loud. Cole watched it from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was thinking something. He wasn't ready to speak into the air yet. And then he turned and went back to the barn, and Rosemary caught only the tail end of his boots, disappearing around the corner. But she'd seen his face, and she tucked that away in the same place she tucked all the things she didn't know what to do with yet. The trouble came from town that same evening. She heard the horse before she heard the knock. A fast approach, single rider. The kind of pace that meant either urgency or performance. And in her experience, those two things were rarely the same. The knock was sharp and deliberate, and when she opened the door, she found a woman she had not yet met, standing on the porch in a wool coat with brass buttons and the expression of someone who has appointed themselves to an important errand. "You're the woman from the stagecoach," the woman said. "I'm Rosemary Bennett," Rosemary said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Harriet Voss. I'm on the church committee." She said this the way people say things they expect to produce a specific effect. "I've come to speak to Mr. Walker." "He's in the barn," Rosemary said. "I can get him for you, or you're welcome to wait." Harriet Voss looked past her into the kitchen with the specific brand of inventory taking that dressed itself up as concern. "Are the children inside? They're doing their lessons. And you're managing the household." "I am." "Unchaperoned," Harriet said, and left the word sitting between them like a stone dropped into still water. Rosemary looked at her steadily. "I beg your pardon." "An unmarried woman living in the home of a widowed man, Miss Bennett. I'm sure you understand why members of the community might have concerns." She folded her hands in front of her. "We're a Christian town. We care about the example being set for the children." The air between them was very still. "I see," Rosemary said. "And what example specifically concerns you?" "Well," Harriet seemed slightly thrown by the directness. She had clearly expected something more yielding. "The impropriety. The situation." "The situation," Rosemary said, "is that 3 children have warm meals and clean clothes and help with their schoolwork for the first time in longer than their father can exactly remember. If that is the impropriety you've come to address, Mrs. Voss, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you." Harriet's chin lifted. "I don't think you quite understand. Cole." Rosemary did not raise her voice. She simply said the name clearly, and Cole Walker, who had come out of the barn and was crossing the yard, stopped when he heard it and changed his direction toward the porch. He looked at Harriet Voss. He looked at the set of Rosemary's shoulders. He read the situation with the quick, accurate reading of a man who had grown up around people who caused trouble while smiling. "Harriet," he said, "something I can do for you." "I came to speak with you about your arrangement," Harriet said carefully. "Miss Bennett works for me," Cole said. "She takes care of my children. That's the arrangement." "Cole, people are talking." "People talk," Cole said. "It's their primary occupation. This is a serious matter. Reverend Stills was asking just this Sunday about—" "Tell Reverend Stills," Cole said, and his voice had not risen at all, had in fact gotten quieter, which Rosemary recognized as the more dangerous direction, "that my children ate a hot supper tonight for the 7th night in a row. Tell him that my son slept through the night for the first time in 4 months. And then ask him which he thinks the Lord would consider the greater priority." He held the door open. "Safe ride back to town, Harriet." Harriet Voss looked at Rosemary one more time. The look was not kind. It was the look of a woman filing information away for later use. Then she turned and went back to her horse. Cole let the door close. He stood in the kitchen with his hat still on and looked at Rosemary, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "That won't be the end of it," Rosemary said. "No," Cole said. "It won't. I can go back to town, find a room at the boarding house. Come out during the day only." "And who braids Lucy's hair at 6 in the morning?" Cole said. "Who sits with Ben when he wakes up at midnight? Who—" He stopped. He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "No," he said. "You're not going anywhere because Harriet Voss is bored and righteous. This is my house, and those are my children, and I decide what they need." Rosemary was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on and went back to the barn, and Rosemary turned back to the stove, and Lucy's voice floated down from upstairs, asking whether Ben had taken her pencil again, and Ben did not answer because Ben never answered, but the sound of small feet running across the floor above suggested he had taken it and was not apologetic about it. And the house breathed. It kept breathing. But Rosemary stood at the stove and listened to the sound of Harriet Voss's horse carrying her back toward Silver Creek, and she knew, with the particular clarity of a woman who had been the subject of other people's conversations her entire life, that whatever was coming next would be larger than a single church committee member on a Monday evening. It always was. She stirred the pot and said nothing. And outside, the Montana sky went dark, and the town sat 2 miles west with its lights burning and its opinions already forming. And for now, the Walker Ranch was warm, and the children were fed, and that was the only thing Rosemary permitted herself to hold on to tonight. Just tonight. Just this. The formal notice arrived on a Wednesday. It came folded inside an envelope with the Silver Creek Community Church seal pressed into the wax, delivered by a boy of about 12, who handed it to Rosemary at the door, looked at her once, and ran back to his horse like he'd been warned not to linger. She stood in the doorway and read it twice before she went inside, and she did not change her expression while she read it, because she had learned a long time ago that the moment other people saw your face fall was the moment they understood the full depth of what they'd managed to do to you. And she was not going to give Silver Creek that. The notice informed Mr. Cole Walker that a community hearing had been organized for the following Friday evening at the Silver Creek Community Church regarding the matter of an unmarried woman of questionable suitability residing in the home of a widowed father of 3. It requested his attendance. It was signed by Reverend Stills Harriet Voss, and 4 other names Rosemary didn't recognize yet, but suspected she would come to know well enough before this was finished. She set the letter on the kitchen table and went back to the bread she was making. Cole found it an hour later. She heard him read it. She could always tell when Cole was reading something that made him angry, because he went very quiet in a specific way, not the ordinary quiet of a man thinking, but the tight, concentrated quiet of a man deciding how much of what he's feeling he's going to allow out into the open. "Rosemary," he said. "I saw it," she said. "You should have. I was going to show you at supper." She kept working the dough. "I didn't want to ruin the morning." He put the letter down. "I'll go into town today. Talk to Reverend Stills directly." "And say what?" She looked up then. "Cole, what are you going to say to him that he doesn't already have an answer for? He's decided what this situation is. Going in there alone won't change his mind. It'll just give him the opportunity to deliver the verdict in private instead of in public, which suits him better and helps us less." Cole looked at her. "Then what do you want to do?" "I want to go to the hearing," she said. The quiet that followed that was a different kind entirely. "Rosemary, I want to look them in the face," she said, and her voice was steady, the way a voice gets steady when it has stopped being afraid of the thing it's been afraid of for a very long time. "I have spent my entire life being talked about in rooms I wasn't allowed into. I'm not doing that again." Cole picked up the letter. He folded it once deliberately. He set it back down. "All right," he said. "Then we go to the hearing." What neither of them anticipated was Emma. She came home from school the next afternoon with a different quality of silence around her. Not the ordinary guarded silence Rosemary had come to understand as Emma's baseline, but something sharper and more internal. The kind that meant something had happened and was still happening inside her, and she hadn't decided what to do with it yet. Rosemary waited. She had learned that with Emma waiting was the only approach that worked. Push and the girl sealed herself off entirely. Wait, and eventually the pressure of holding it became greater than the discomfort of releasing it. It took until after supper. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway while Rosemary was cleaning up, and she stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw set and said without preamble, "They're saying you trapped Papa." Rosemary stopped. At school, Emma said. Cora Voss told everyone. She said you came here on purpose to trap a lonely man with money because you couldn't get a man any other way. The kitchen was very quiet. What did you say to Cora Voss? Rosemary asked. Emma's jaw tightened further. I didn't say anything. I walked away. She paused. I wanted to say something. I didn't know what. Rosemary turned to face her fully. You don't have to defend me, Emma. I know I don't have to, Emma said with a flash of something fierce behind her eyes. That's not why I wanted to. She unfolded her arms and pressed her hands flat on the doorframe. And for a moment she looked exactly the age she was 11 years old. Furious and helpless in the way that only children can be furious and helpless, when they see an injustice clearly and don't yet have the tools to address it. She was wrong, Emma said. Cora Voss was wrong, and her mother is wrong, and all those people at that church are wrong. And I know they're wrong because I live here, and they don't. Rosemary looked at her for a long moment. Emma, she said, come here. Emma came into the kitchen, and Rosemary sat down at the table, which brought them to the same height, and she looked at the girl who had spent 3 months timing how long she would stay and said, You can come to the hearing if you want to. That is your decision, not mine or your father's. But whatever you decide, whatever happens in that church on Friday, I need you to know that none of what they're saying changes anything about this house. Do you understand me? Emma stared at her. You're still here after a week, Emma said. It was not quite an answer to what Rosemary had said. It was something older and more private than that. I'm still here, Rosemary said. Emma nodded once, sharp and quick, and went to bed without saying anything else. Friday came the way things come when you've been dreading them faster than felt fair and slower than felt survivable. The Silver Creek Community Church could hold roughly 80 people. When Cole and Rosemary arrived, it held closer to 110, because a town that has organized itself around a conflict will always draw more spectators than it expects. They filed in through the front doors, and the noise dropped by half immediately, and Rosemary walked down the center aisle, without looking left or right, her coat buttoned to the neck, her hands at her sides, her chin exactly level. She sat in the third row. Cole sat beside her. Behind them, small and unannounced Emma, Lucy, and Ben filed into the bench in the row directly behind. Cole turned when he heard them settle. Emma, you should not have brought your brother and sister. We came ourselves, Emma said. Ben wanted to come. Cole looked at Ben. Ben was looking at the front of the church with the same wide, careful eyes he turned on everything he wasn't sure about yet. He did not look at his father. He sat very straight with his hands in his lap, and Rosemary, who was not supposed to see this from where she was sitting, turned just enough to catch it from the corner of her eye, and something in her chest pulled tight and did not release. Reverend Stills opened the hearing with a prayer which Rosemary thought was a particular kind of audacity, and then laid out the community's concerns in the measured, reasonable-sounding language that people use when they want to cause harm, without appearing to be the one causing it. He spoke about Christian values. He spoke about propriety. He spoke about the impressionable minds of 3 young children and the example being modeled in their home. He did not once look directly at Rosemary while he spoke. Then Harriet Voss stood up and explained in precise and careful language that the committee was not making any accusations of immorality. Here, she paused long enough for the word to land in everyone's mind, but simply expressing concern for the Walker children's welfare and the community's moral standing. A man in the second row said loudly enough to carry, "A woman like that's got no business raising somebody else's children." The room shifted. Cole stood up. "A woman like what exactly?" His voice was flat and quiet and absolutely clear. "Say it out plain, Harold, so everyone here can hear what you actually mean." Harold did not say it out plain. He looked at the floor. "Thought so," Cole said, and sat back down. Reverend Stills cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, this is not an adversarial proceeding." "Then stop running it like one," Cole said. Harriet Voss folded her hands. "Perhaps Miss Bennett would like to address the community directly. Explain her intentions. Her background. Her background," Rosemary said. The room went still. She stood up. She had not planned to speak yet. She had not planned anything exactly. But Harriet Voss had said her background in a tone that meant something specific, and Rosemary was done. She was entirely, completely, finally done with sitting quietly while other people used that tone about her. "My name is Rosemary Bennett," she said. "I came to Silver Creek from Chicago because I answered an advertisement placed by a man who needed help caring for his children. I have been in the Walker home for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks I have cooked every meal mended, every torn piece of clothing sat beside a 5-year-old boy through every nightmare he's had, and braided the same little girl's hair every single morning before 6 o'clock. She paused. "If anyone in this room believes that constitutes a threat to those children's welfare, I would genuinely like to understand their reasoning, because from where I'm standing, the greater threat to those children's welfare was the 12 women who came before me and left." The room was very quiet. "I am not pretty," Rosemary said, and her voice did not shake. "I am not small. I am not the kind of woman that men in this town look at and decide has value. I have spent 34 years understanding that about how this world works. But I am also not going to stand in this building and let a committee of people who have never set foot inside that house tell me what I am or am not fit to do. Not today." She sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lucy stood up. She was 7 years old, and she was shaking so hard that the bench trembled slightly when she pushed herself upright. Her face was white. Her hands were clenched in front of her. She opened her mouth, and for a terrible second, nothing came out, and then her voice arrived small, unsteady, completely honest. "Miss Rosemary is the first person who made our house feel warm again," Lucy said. "Since Mama died. She is the first person." She swallowed hard. "And I don't understand why that's bad." She sat back down. And then Emma stood up. Emma, who had spent 3 weeks measuring and waiting and keeping every door locked. Emma, who had watched 11 women come and go and had stopped believing that anything held. Emma stood up in that church in front of 110 people and did not shake at all. "My name is Emma Walker," she said. "I am 11 years old. I have been running this family since my mother died because my father was too broken with grief to do it alone and there was nobody else." She looked directly at Harriet Voss. "You all came to that ranch twice to check on us in 2 years. Miss Rosemary has been there every single day for 3 weeks. She looked at Reverend Stills. You judged her the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. You decided what she was before she'd said a single word, because of how she looks." Her voice was clear and steady and devastating. "That is not a Christian value. That is just cruelty with a nicer name." The silence was absolute. And then something happened that no one in that church, not Rosemary, not Cole, not Harriet Voss, not Reverend Stills had anticipated. Ben Walker slid off the bench. He walked past Emma. He walked past Lucy. He walked past his father's outstretched hand. Cole reached for him automatically, expecting him to need steadying, and Ben moved around it without looking up, and kept walking until he reached the 3rd row, and he climbed up beside Rosemary. And he put both arms around as much of her as he could reach, and he pressed his face against her side, and into the wool of her coat in a voice so small that only the people nearest to him could hear it. In a voice that had not spoken a single full word in 8 months, he said, "Mama." Rosemary stopped breathing. The word went through her like something breaking open. She had prepared herself for many things that day. She had prepared herself for cruelty and dismissal, and the particular humiliation of being judged and found lacking in public, which was not a new experience, only a more formal one. She had not prepared herself for this. She had not let herself imagine this. Her arms came around him, automatically, completely. She held that small, solid, stubborn boy against her chest in the middle of Silver Creek Community Church in front of 110 people, and she pressed her lips against the top of his hair, and she did not look at anyone else in the room, because for that moment, there was no one else in the room. Cole Walker sat in the row ahead of them. He had turned when he heard Ben move. He had watched his son walk past his hand. He had watched Ben press himself into Rosemary's arms. He had heard the word. The single enormous ordinary word that his son had not been able to produce in 8 months. Not for the doctor, not for the teacher, not for Cole himself. No matter how gently he'd tried, no matter how many nights he'd sat beside that small bed and waited. He heard it now. And something happened in Cole Walker's chest that he had not felt in 2 years and did not have a name for yet, but it was large and certain, and it had absolutely nothing to do with pity or gratitude or practical necessity. He looked at Rosemary. She was holding his son, and her eyes were closed, and her arms were wrapped around Ben, like she was the one being held, rather than the one doing the holding. And Cole Walker understood in that moment, with the clarity of something that has been true for a while, and finally decided to be known, that he was in serious trouble. Reverend Stills said something. Cole did not hear it. Harriet Voss said something. Cole did not hear that either. He was looking at Rosemary Bennett, who had come to his door 3 weeks ago with a torn suitcase and a spine, made of something harder than anything this town had tried so far, and who was holding his son, and who had made his daughters feel safe, and who had stood up in this building tonight without a single person in her corner, and said, "I am not going to sit quietly." And he thought with a certainty that surprised him with its simplicity, that he had no idea how he had managed even the past 3 weeks without understanding what was right in front of him. The hearing dissolved around them. People began to talk. Voices rose and crossed each other. Harriet Voss said something to Reverend Stills in a low, rapid voice. The man named Harold looked at the floor and did not look up again. None of it reached Rosemary. She held Ben Walker and Ben held her. And in the row behind them, Lucy pressed her face into Emma's shoulder, and Emma put her arm around her sister and looked straight ahead with dry eyes, and an expression that had finally, after 11 years, decided it was safe to let go of something. The ride home from the church was the quietest Cole Walker had ever driven that road. Ben was asleep before they cleared the edge of town, his head against Rosemary's arm, his breathing slow and even, like a child who has spent 8 months carrying something enormous and has finally, in the space of 1 evening, been permitted to set it down. Lucy sat on Rosemary's other side and held her hand without comment, without explanation, the way children hold on to things they've decided belong to them. Emma rode in the wagon bed behind them, and Rosemary knew without turning around that Emma was not asleep. Emma was sitting with her back straight, and her eyes open, watching the dark road unwind behind them, thinking the way Emma always thought, which was thoroughly and without mercy. Cole drove and said nothing. He had said nothing since the church. He'd stood up when the noise rose after Ben spoke, gathered his children with the efficient quietness of a man who has decided the conversation is finished, nodded once to Reverend Stills in a way that communicated everything and required no words, and walked his family out the front door of Silver Creek Community Church while the room was still deciding what had happened. He had helped Rosemary up to the bench, his hand at her elbow. Brief, steady. And then he'd picked up the reins, and they'd moved through the dark in silence, and the silence had a quality to it that Rosemary couldn't quite name. Not the comfortable silence of people who had run out of necessary things to say, but the dense, pressurized silence of people standing on either side of something large, not yet ready to look at it directly. She carried Ben inside when they arrived. He didn't wake. She laid him down and pulled the quilt up, and stood for a moment, with her hand resting on the edge of the mattress. And in the dark, she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened in that church. Not the hearing, not Harriet Voss, not the crowd, but that small voice saying the one word that had broken something open inside her that she was not certain she knew how to close back up. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt. Then she straightened, picked up the lamp, and went back downstairs. Cole was sitting at the kitchen table. He had poured himself a measure of whiskey and had not touched it. He was sitting with both hands around the glass and his eyes on the surface of the table, and when Rosemary came in, he looked up and then looked back down, which told her he had heard her on the stairs and had been deciding for those few seconds what he intended to say. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." Rosemary. He said her name the way he always said it, plain, deliberate, without decoration. "Sit down." She sat down. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the kitchen had that particular nighttime feeling of a house that has folded in on itself, quiet and close and private, in a way that daylight never permitted. "I want you to know," Cole said, "that what happened tonight doesn't change your position here. The town can think whatever it wants. I told you before, this is my house." "I know," Rosemary said. "But—" He stopped. He turned the glass once in his hands. "But I also want to know if you're all right, because that was—" He stopped again. "That was a great deal to put a person through, and I should have found a way to stop it before it got that far, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." Rosemary looked at him. In 34 years, she could count on one hand the number of times a man had apologized to her for something that wasn't her fault to begin with. She sat with that for a moment before she answered. "It wasn't yours to stop," she said. "They'd made up their minds before we walked in. You know that." "Doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Cole finally picked up the glass. He held it without drinking. "Ben hasn't spoken," he said. "Not since the funeral. The doctor said he said sometimes children do that, retreat inside themselves. He said to give him time." His voice dropped slightly. "I gave him time. 8 months. I sat beside that boy every night for 8 months, and I talked to him and I read to him, and I told him it was all right that he could talk when he was ready, and he just—" He set the glass back down. "He never did. Until tonight." Rosemary didn't speak. "You've been here 3 weeks, Cole said." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the glass, or at something beyond the glass, something that existed in a dimension slightly removed from the kitchen. 3 weeks, and he held your hand the first day, and now he's— He pressed his mouth closed briefly. "I don't know what you did." "I didn't do anything," Rosemary said. "I just stayed." "That's not nothing," Cole said. "That's not nothing at all." The fire shifted in the stove. Outside the window, the Montana wind moved through the dark in long, cold sweeps, and neither of them spoke, and the not speaking had a texture to it now, something almost gentle. "Cole," Rosemary said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her then. Really looked the way he had on that first day outside the stage office, not past her, not through her, but at her, with the full attention of a man who was listening. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "that it might be better for all of you, for the children, for your standing in this town if I were to find a room in Silver Creek. Come out during the days only. Do the work here and then go back at night." She kept her voice even. "What happened tonight won't be the end of it. You know that as well as I do. And whatever I might be contributing to this household, I am not worth the cost of your reputation and your children's peace in their own town." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had a specific temperature to it. Cole set the whiskey glass down with a sound that was slightly more deliberate than it needed to be. "Is that what you want?" he said. "It isn't about what I want. I asked what you want." Rosemary looked at her hands. "That question is not as useful as you might think," she said. "What I want has not historically been a reliable guide to what is wise." "What does that mean?" She looked up. "It means I have been wrong before about whether I belonged somewhere. More than once. And I have learned not to trust the feeling of belonging until I have evidence that it's real, rather than something I've constructed, because I needed it to be real." Cole was very still. "Do you feel like you belong here?" he asked. His voice was quiet. There was no performance in it. It was a plain question from a man who needed a plain answer. Rosemary opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Yes," she said. "Against my better judgment?" "Yes." "Then stop talking about leaving," he said. She shook her head. "Cole, Rosemary." He leaned forward, both elbows on the table. I am asking you plainly not to go, not to the boarding house, not to a room in town, not anywhere." He stopped. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" She looked at him. "I'm not entirely sure I do," she said. He pushed back from the table and stood up, and he crossed to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the particular tension in his shoulders of a man marshaling himself for something that did not come easily. He turned around. "My wife was the bravest person I ever knew," he said. "She wasn't loud about it. She wasn't the kind of brave that shows. She was just steady. Every day. No matter what came." He stopped. "When she died, I thought that was finished. I thought that kind of thing, that steadiness, that—" He pressed his hand briefly over his mouth. "I thought it was a thing that happened once in a life, and I'd had mine, and that was the end of it." Rosemary sat very still. "And then you stepped off that stage," Cole said. "And every woman who'd come before you was already laughing before you'd said a word, and you walked toward me like there was nobody else on that boardwalk, like none of it was there." He shook his head. "And then my son held your hand." "Cole, let me finish." He said it quietly, but with an absolute finality that stopped her. "I need to finish this, or I won't." He looked at her directly. "Every day I watched you in this house. I watched you with Emma, how you didn't push her, and didn't pretend, and just kept showing up until she let you close enough to matter. I watched you with Lucy. I watched what you did for Ben." He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "And I kept telling myself it was gratitude. I kept telling myself I was just grateful, and that was a reasonable thing to feel. And it didn't mean anything larger than that." He stopped again. "I was wrong." The kitchen was completely silent. "Cole," Rosemary said carefully, "I came here to work. I came here for the children." "I know why you came," he said. "I'm telling you what happened after." She stood up. She did not know why she stood up. Her legs simply made the decision before her mind caught up with it. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at Cole Walker, who was standing 4 feet away from her, and looking back, and she said with all the honesty she could manage, "I am not an easy woman. I am not small, and I am not quiet, and I take up more space than people want me to take up, and I have strong opinions about most things, and I am never going to be the kind of woman that a town like Silver Creek looks at and decides is appropriate." Her voice held. "You need to know that. Before you say anything else, you need to know all of that, because I am not going to become something else for anyone. Not anymore." Cole took 2 steps toward her. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. "When I look at you, Rosie," he said, and it was the first time he had called her that Rosie soft and deliberate, like it had been waiting, "I don't see a woman who's too much." His voice was rough at the edges in the way voices get when a person is working to hold something large inside them. "I see the only woman who stayed." Rosemary stopped breathing. Something happened inside her chest that she had no adequate name for. Not the sudden dramatic breaking of something that stories described, but something quieter and more devastating. Like a door that had been locked for a very long time, finally being opened from the inside by a mechanism she hadn't known was there. Her eyes filled. She did not try to stop it. For the first time in 11 months and 37 days, she did not calculate who was watching or what they would think, or whether it made her look weak or foolish or too easily undone. She was in a private kitchen at midnight with a man who had just said the truest and most damaging thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could clearly remember, and she let her eyes fill, and she did not look away. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I don't have any practice at this. Any of this." "Neither do I," Cole said. "Not anymore." She pressed her hand against her sternum. It was an instinctive gesture, pressing down against the feeling to try to contain it, and Cole saw it, and something in his expression shifted into something softer than she had yet seen on him. He reached out and took her hand. The one pressed against her chest, and held it between both of his. "The way you hold something, you are being careful with. You gave my son his voice back," he said. "You gave my daughters, you gave Emma reasons to trust again. You gave Lucy someone who listens." He held her hand. "There is nothing I could offer you that would be equal to that. I know that. But I am asking anyway because I am a selfish man at heart, and because my children are asleep upstairs, and I do not want to imagine this house without you in it." The fire in the stove had almost gone out. The wind pressed at the window, and Rosemary Bennett, who had come to Silver Creek expecting to be turned away, who had burned a letter on a boardwalk and walked into uncertainty because she had run out of other options, who had sat on a narrow bed on her first night in a stranger's house and told herself very firmly not to trust the feeling of belonging, looked at Cole Walker's hands around hers and said, "I'm not going anywhere." The breath Cole released was not dramatic. It was not the breath of a man in a story. It was the breath of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had just been told he didn't have to hold it alone anymore, and it was quiet and exhausted and entirely real. He did not kiss her. He did not say anything more. He simply stood there holding her hand in the dark kitchen for a moment that belonged entirely to them, and then he pressed his thumb once across her knuckles gently and let go. "Get some sleep," he said. His voice was rough and warm. "You too," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the table. He was almost at the hallway when Emma's voice came from the bottom of the stairs. Both of them turned. Emma was standing there in her nightgown with her arms crossed and her hair loose, and she had clearly been there for some portion of that conversation, and her expression was not the careful armored expression she usually wore, but something younger and more open and slightly embarrassed at being caught. "I couldn't sleep," Emma said, without any particular conviction. "Go to bed, Emma," Cole said. Emma looked at Rosemary. Something moved across her face, quick and complicated, and then finally simple. "Good night, Miss Rosemary," she said. "Good night, Emma," Rosemary said. Emma went back upstairs. Cole looked at Rosemary once more, and in his eyes there was something she had not seen in any man's eyes before, or at least had not seen directed at her. Not pity, not tolerance, not the particular brand of assessment that always preceded disappointment. Just steadiness. Just the plain and uncomplicated steadiness of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Then he went down the hall. Rosemary stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment. She pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at nothing in particular, and let what had just happened exist inside her without trying immediately to analyze it or diminish it or prepare herself for how it might go wrong. She stood there until her breathing was ordinary again. Then she banked the stove, trimmed the lamp, and went upstairs to bed. And outside, the Montana sky had cleared, and the stars were out in numbers that had no business existing anywhere near a town that had tried tonight to make her feel small, and she lay on her back in the narrow bed, and looked at the ceiling, and felt with a certainty she had not permitted herself in longer than she could accurately measure that the ground beneath her was solid, that it would hold, that she had not been wrong. Spring came to Montana the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. 3 warm days followed by a hard freeze, then mud, then morning light that lasted longer than it had any right to. Then suddenly the fields were green, and the air smelled like something beginning again, whether you'd asked it to or not. Rosemary noticed it first in Ben. He started talking in pieces. Single words at breakfast, more when he wanted biscuits cold, when his boots weren't by the fire, Emma, when he needed his sister and couldn't find her. Each word arrived like something carefully saved up, offered with the particular precision of a child who understood that words had weight and was not going to waste them. By the 3rd week after the church hearing, he was putting 2 words together. By the 4th, 3. Cole would go still every time it happened. He never made a scene of it. He never said listen to that or called attention to it in a way that might make Ben feel watched. He simply went still, the way a man goes still in the presence of something he is grateful for, and does not trust himself to express out loud without breaking. One morning, Rosemary was at the stove when Ben appeared at her elbow, which was his custom, now arriving without announcement, occupying whatever space she occupied, like a small planet pulled into orbit. "Rosemary," he said. She turned. He had her apron string in his hand, not pulling it, just holding it the way he held things that belonged to her. "What is it, Ben?" He looked up at her with those serious eyes. "Is it Saturday?" 3 words. A full question delivered with the earnest concentration of a child who had worked very hard to assemble them correctly. "It is," she said. "Can we make the honey biscuits?" She looked at him for a moment that she would remember for the rest of her life. "We absolutely can," she said. She handed him the honey jar, and he carried it to the table with both hands, and the focused solemnity of someone entrusted with something important, and Rosemary turned back to the stove and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for exactly 3 seconds before she collected herself and reached for the flour. Emma's change was slower and more private, and therefore more complete. She stopped timing. That was the first sign she stopped counting days, stopped maintaining the internal tally of how long Rosemary had lasted, stopped holding herself at the specific distance that allowed for a clean exit when the leaving came. She didn't announce this. She simply one morning sat down next to Rosemary at the kitchen table without being invited and spread her schoolwork between them and said, "I don't understand this arithmetic." And that was the end of the distance. She started defending Rosemary at school before Rosemary knew there was anything to defend. Rosemary found out from Lucy, which was how she found out most things that happened beyond her direct line of sight, because Lucy had not yet learned the social calculation of deciding what information other people needed versus what they'd merely find interesting. Emma made Cora Voss cry today. Lucy announced at supper, with a satisfaction she did not attempt to conceal. Cole looked up from his plate. "Emma." "She said things first," Emma said without looking up from her food. "What things?" Rosemary asked. Emma set down her fork. "She said you were still there because Papa felt sorry for you. Because no decent man would choose someone like you freely." She picked up her fork. "So I told her that my father is the best judge of character I have ever met. And if he chose Rosemary, then that says more about Rosemary than anything Cora's mother could put in a letter to the church committee." The table was quiet. "And then she cried," Lucy added helpfully. "I didn't make her cry on purpose," Emma said. "I just said true things." Cole looked at his eldest daughter with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. "We don't set out to make people cry, Emma." "No, sir," Emma said. "Sometimes it just happens when you tell the truth." Rosemary looked down at her plate so that none of them could see her face clearly, and she breathed once carefully. And the thing she felt in that moment was so large and so unexpected that she had no adequate category for it. She had spent 34 years being tolerated. She had never had anyone defend her in her absence before. Not once. Not in Chicago, not in any of the rooms and situations and careful humiliations that had preceded Silver Creek. She had not known how much that cost until she felt the weight of it lift. The proposal came on an unremarkable Tuesday. Cole had been out since before dawn, checking the east fence line, and Rosemary was in the yard, hanging laundry, when she heard his horse come back. She heard him unsaddle, heard him at the pump, heard his boots on the porch steps. She kept working. The sheets were heavy, and the wind was cooperating, and she was focused on the pins. He came and stood beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. He picked up the other end of a sheet and held it while she pinned it, which he had started doing in the past few weeks without comment. And she had accepted without comment, because that was how they had learned to move around each other in the language of small useful actions rather than declarations. "I went past the land office this morning," he said. "Oh. Saw Judge Barlow on the way back?" He handed her another pin. "We had a conversation." Rosemary glanced at him. His voice had the careful quality it had when he was approaching something from the side, rather than directly. "About," she said. "About what it would take," Cole said, "to make certain arrangements permanent." She stopped with the pin in her hand. "Permanent," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the sheet, not at her, with the particular studied focus of a man who is finding it necessary to look at something neutral while he says a thing he cannot say while also managing eye contact. "Cole," she said, Are you asking me something?" "I'm getting to it," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he put down the sheet and turned toward her and did look at her. Then directly, with the full, plain honesty that was the thing she had come to understand was the most essential part of who he was. "Marry me, Rosie," he said. It was not elaborate. It was not a speech. It was 4 words said by a man who had decided and was not interested in decorating the decision. Not because it settles the question with the town. Not because it's the practical thing. Because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I want to know is whether you're already in the kitchen, and the last thing I think about at night is whether you're all right, and I am done pretending that is something less than what it is. Rosemary looked at him. Every instinct she had built over 34 years, every careful, protective, self-preserving instinct she had constructed precisely for moments like this one, rose up simultaneously and told her to find the reason it wasn't real, to locate the angle, to prepare herself for the version of this where it went wrong, because everything like this had always gone wrong, because she had always been the woman who was almost chosen and then wasn't who was good enough, until something better appeared, who was useful, but not quite. "Yes," she said. The word came out before the instincts finished their argument. It came from somewhere below, all of that careful architecture, some part of her that had been watching Cole Walker for 4 months, and had made its own accounting and arrived at its own conclusion. Cole let out a breath. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, with 2 fingers, brief and gentle, and he said, "Good. That's settled then." "That's settled," she agreed, and they went back to hanging the laundry because that was who they were, and it was enough. The twist that nobody in Silver Creek had anticipated came in the form of Harriet Voss at the front door on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the wedding. Rosemary opened the door and found her standing on the porch with her hands clasped in front of her and an expression that did not fit her face comfortably. Something stripped of its usual authority. Something that looked under careful examination, like a woman who had been arguing with herself for a long time and had finally lost. "Miss Bennet," Harriet said. "Mrs. Voss," Rosemary said. A silence. "May I come in?" Harriet asked. Rosemary considered that for exactly as long as it took to determine that the answer was yes, and then she stepped back and held the door open, and Harriet Voss walked into the Walker kitchen and sat down at the table, and Rosemary put the kettle on, because she had been raised by a woman who believed that the kettle was the appropriate response to most human situations. Harriet looked around the kitchen. The clean surfaces, the mended curtains, the children's school books stacked neatly on the side bench, the drawing Lucy had made that was pinned to the wall beside the window, the pair of small boots lined up by the door with the mud cleaned off them. She looked at all of it with the expression of a woman performing a private reckoning. "I owe you an apology," Harriet said. Rosemary set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her. "I organized that hearing," Harriet said. "I told myself it was about the children, about propriety, about the community's well-being." She stopped. "That was not entirely honest. Some of it was about—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "I have a daughter. She is 26 and unmarried, and she has had difficulty. And when I saw you step off that stage, I thought—" She stopped again. "It doesn't matter what I thought. What I thought was unkind, and it was wrong, and what I did on the basis of it caused you harm, and I am sorry for that." The kitchen was quiet. Rosemary looked at Harriet Voss. She looked at the hands clasped on the table and the jaw that was working to stay composed, and the eyes that were doing the careful, dignified thing that women of a certain time and position did when they were trying to apologize without fully collapsing. "I appreciate you coming," Rosemary said. "I heard Ben spoke at the hearing," Harriet said. "I heard what he called you." "Yes?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "My sister lost a child," she said. "She used to say that the worst part wasn't the grief. The worst part was watching the world keep moving while she stood still." She looked at Rosemary directly. "Those children were standing still. I could see it. She stopped. "I decided it was easier to object to you than to admit I didn't know how to help them." Rosemary poured the tea. She slid a cup across the table. "Then help them now," she said. "Help them going forward. Cora and Emma are going to be neighbors their whole lives. It would be better for everyone, if that started differently than it has. Harriet wrapped both hands around the cup. She looked down at the tea. You're more generous than I deserve. I'm practical, Rosemary said. Generosity and practicality sometimes look the same from the outside. Harriet Voss almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, but it was the beginning of one, and Rosemary counted that as its own kind of progress. The wedding was small and plain and entirely completely theirs. Cole had asked Reverend Stills to perform the ceremony only because Emma had argued with impeccable logic that having a different minister ride out from Billings would make the whole town feel like an accusation, and Emma was usually right about social dynamics. So Reverend Stills performed the ceremony, and he did it with more genuine grace than Rosemary had expected from him, and she appreciated that, without holding what had come before against what was happening now. Emma stood beside Rosemary. She had asked to. She had come to Rosemary's room the night before, and knocked, and come in, and stood in the middle of the floor, and said with characteristic bluntness, I want to stand with you tomorrow, if that's acceptable. It's more than acceptable, Rosemary had said. Emma had nodded. Then she had crossed the room and hugged her quickly, firmly, with the contained intensity of someone who did not do things halfway, and then let go, and went back to bed, and Rosemary had sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time afterward, holding on to the shape of that. Lucy cried through the entire ceremony, and did not apologize for it once. Ben stood at his father's side, and held the ring in his closed fist. And when the moment came, he opened his hand and held it out, and said clearly and without prompting, Here, Papa. And Cole's hand was not entirely steady when he took it. When it was done, and the handful of guests they'd invited began talking and moving toward the table Lucy had decorated with spring flowers gathered that morning, Ben found Rosemary. He took her hand. 3 fingers, same as the first day. And he looked up at her with those eyes that had been watching the world from a safe distance for 8 months and were now slowly finding it less dangerous than he'd feared. Rosemary, he said. She looked down at him. He turned her name over in his mind for a moment. She could see him do it, see the small, precise working of his face, and then he said, That's a long name. It is, she agreed. Can I call you Mama? He asked. Always? Not just sometimes. Rosemary crouched down to his level. She took his face in both her hands gently, the way you hold something you are terrified of breaking and are also terrified of holding too loosely. You can call me Mama, she said. Always, every day, for as long as you want. Ben nodded once decisively like a contract had been signed, and he was satisfied with the terms. Then Emma appeared behind him and took his other hand and said, Come eat something, Ben, before Lucy finishes the cake. And Ben went, and Rosemary stood up and watched her children move through the afternoon light, and the day felt like something she had no adequate language for and had stopped needing one. Cole appeared at her shoulder. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. You sure? Cole. She turned to look at him. I am sure. I am completely entirely sure. I have not been sure of many things in my life, and I am telling you this is one of them. He looked at her for a moment with that plain, direct steadiness that she had come to understand was his particular variety of love, not performed, not decorated, not aimed at an audience, just real and present, and quietly absolute. Good, he said. He put his hand at the small of her back, brief and warm, and they went to join their family. That evening, after the guests were gone and the dishes were done, and the fire had burned down to coals, and the house had folded into its nighttime quiet, Rosemary went upstairs and tucked Lucy in and kissed her forehead, and listened to Lucy describe in exact detail every flower at the table, and which ones she'd picked herself, and which ones Emma had rejected on aesthetic grounds. And then she went to Emma's room and stood in the doorway, and Emma looked up from her book and said, "Good night, Mama," with the particular matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided something and was not going to make a production of it, and Rosemary said good night and pulled the door halfway closed and stood in the hall for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she went to Ben's room. He was already in bed, already half asleep, already somewhere between one world and the next, his breathing slow and his hair at its usual, improbable angle. She reached down and straightened his quilt and bent and pressed her lips to his forehead, and he stirred just enough to know she was there, and in the soft, unhurried voice of a child who is almost all the way into sleep, he said it. "Good night, Mama." 2 words. The same 2 words he'd said every night since the church, and every night they landed differently, because a thing that is true does not wear out with repetition. It deepens. It settles further into the places it belongs. Rosemary stood in the dark of that small room and listened to him breathe, and she felt the full weight of everything that had brought her to this particular doorway. The letter she'd burned on a boardwalk in winter. The advertisement printed in small type at the bottom of a page. The stagecoach and the cold air, and the women laughing, and the small hand that had found hers before she'd had time to brace for the rejection she'd expected. She felt all of it, and for the first time in 34 years, she felt none of it as loss. The woman who had come to Silver Creek carrying a torn suitcase and the accumulated weight of every person who had ever looked past her or through her or decided before she'd spoken that she was not quite enough, that woman had set something down. Somewhere between the stagecoach and this darkened doorway, and she was not going to pick it back up. She was not too much. She was not too little. She was exactly what 3 children had needed when the world had gone quiet and cold, and exactly what a broken man had needed when he'd stopped being able to see the shape of his own future, and she had not become those things by shrinking, or by apologizing, or by making herself easier for other people to overlook. She had become them simply by staying, by showing up every morning, by choosing every single day to be fully and completely herself, in a world that had spent 34 years telling her that was too much to ask. Rosemary Bennett. Rosemary Walker, now a name she was still learning, the weight of still turning over in her mind, the way you turn over something new and surprising, that turns out to fit better than anything you'd owned before. Pulled Ben's door softly to and walked down the hall to the room where her husband was waiting. And behind her, the Walker Ranch held its children in the dark, and the Montana spring pressed warmth through every wall, and that was not the beginning of her story. It was the proof of it. She had never needed to be chosen first by the world. She only needed to stay long enough for the right people to find her. And they had, and she had stayed. And that was everything.